It's been 35 years since the first Zelda game was released on the Nintendo Entertainment System. As a child, this was a game I spent countless hours playing. Between the original Legend of Zelda and the Super Nintendo's Link to the Past, I completely immersed myself in the world of Hyrule, and every Halloween, there was one fictional character that I wanted to be more than any other. The hero, Link, accompanied with his Master Sword and his iconic shield. It's amazing how it's been roughly 3 decades since these amazing games were defining my childhood. And yet, after all these years, a new installment in the franchise is legitimately rivaling those previous editions for the claim of my favorite Zelda game of all time. The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is a perfect example of what makes Nintendo games so special. In many ways, the game is a love letter to its legacy, its loyal fanbase, and even its original audience that helped make Nintendo the behemoth that it is today. With that being said, it's also a game that wasn't afraid of trying new things and taking risks. Some new implementations were embraced well by the general audience, others not so much. But what matters most is how Nintendo and Zelda have remained Nintendo and Zelda while also fearlessly looking forward and beyond. I'll get into many of the details and aspects that makes this one an absolute masterpiece, but keep in mind, even the greatest games can still make significant adjustments and improvements, and I've got quite a few of them to offer. First, I want to delve into what Breath of the Wild got right, and what I would like to see more of. Obviously, the world of Hyrule has never been more beautiful and aesthetically pleasing than it is here. The world is rich and it's vast, which begs for hundreds of hours of exploration. The peaceful atmospheres, the iconic themes, and the incredible backdrops offer an experience that's the perfect blend of a calming activity and a thrilling adventure. It's not quite known whether Breath of the Wild 2 will be a completely new world to explore, or if it will be much more of the same Hyrule with an expanded world map. Either way, as long as I'll be experiencing more of the nature and landscapes that the first game had to offer, then I'll be more than thrilled with that. Another incredibly enjoyable aspect about the game was the way it enriched what has historically been a pretty simple story with pretty simple characters. It added interesting details to characters like Link and Zelda without altering them into entirely different characters from the ones we've always known. Link is still the stoic, courageous, quiet, and relatable hero that we've all come to know and love. But through the process of regaining his memories, we discover what his role is in the kingdom, how his relationship with Zelda developed, and even why he's so quiet and never engages in any audible dialogue. This is the kind of storytelling and developments that a young fan can enjoy, but it also respects and understands who the characters have always been, and a longtime fan in his 30s like myself appreciates that immensely. Zelda's character and role hasn't changed, but it was simply enhanced. She's still the princess who needs to be saved, but as usual, she's also a crucial power necessary in order to defeat the evil Ganon, and she remains the driving force and the focal point of the story, hence why the game has always been named after her. But here's the best part about Zelda in Breath of the Wild. This was my first Zelda game where I genuinely cared about saving Zelda. That's because, unlike many of the previous games, her personality and her aspirations are fleshed out. And as we experience Link's memories firsthand, we see how he developed his bond with her. We notice how her worries and sense of responsibility give her humanity, and we even see some of her playful side as she develops her friendship with her royal guard. As we witness Link's bond grow with the princess, I naturally began to feel bonded to her as well. As we see how much she cares and is consumed by the cause, I began to feel consumed and immersed in the cause as well. The decision to have voice actors for Zelda and other crucial characters was an absolute home run. I'll admit, I was skeptical at first, but Nintendo found beautiful and organic ways to make the characters feel even more real and to get us more invested in the story while still respecting the lore, the universe, and the longtime fans. Back to the land of Hyrule, but it's almost impossible for me to complain about anything related to this aspect. The developers did a masterful job of getting the most out of the terrains and the atmosphere. Horseback riding has never been more enjoyable. Ascending the towers and getting your first gaze at the top almost feels like a spiritual experience, and the parasailing isn't just an awesome way to take in the atmosphere, but it's also one of the quickest and most efficient ways of travel. The way the land forces you to interact with its different elements gives it a more realistic and immersive feel. Having to change your clothing based on your surroundings, preparing meals for specific journeys, and even having to remove your metal weapons to avoid being struck by lightning. It's all aspects that are either completely new or just explored on a deeper level in this Zelda game than the games before it, and yet it still captures that traditional Zelda feel for the most part. I could go on and on praising the game and explaining why I enjoy it so much, but I'm sure most of you have heard plenty of that already, and after all, this video is about the future of the franchise. So now seems like a pretty good point to segue into my more critical opinions of this game and how the sequel can improve upon it. Since I was just talking about the landscapes of Hyrule, it's worth mentioning that the seas of Hyrule are extremely underutilized. The amazing Wind Waker GameCube game showed us the joys of traveling the mysterious oceans of Hyrule. Now I understand that this was basically that game's version of Hyrule Field, and asking for anything close to that from Breath of the Wild is a ton to ask for, considering the sheer massiveness of the land of Hyrule as is. But with that being said, the ocean experience still barely scratches the surface on Breath of the Wild, which is just a bit disappointing when its atmosphere exudes so much promise. There's very few islands to explore, there's little to do once you're actually in the water, and having to commute on a raft with a Korok leaf isn't just tedious, but it's also annoying. The sense of adventure almost dies completely once you've reached the shores of Hyrule, which is unfortunate, because with just a little bit more attention given to it, I think it easily could have been one of the most exciting parts of the world. Also, why the heck can't I fish in this game? Sure, that might seem like an insignificant detail to most of you, but some of us really enjoy fishing. It's traditionally been a staple for years throughout the Zelda games, but for some reason, it's not an option on this one. I can catch a freaking moon in Mario Odyssey with a fishing pole, but I can't use a pole to catch fish in Breath of the Wild? There's even a town in the game that's all about its sea life, its seafood, and its island resort atmosphere, but yet, I can't fish there. Anyway, the game is clearly about its general calming and peaceful experience, but maybe a little too peaceful. I realized as I was screen capturing these hours of footage how little fighting is actually necessary. Every once in a while, you'll have the typical Guardian Shrine enemies that you have to destroy to proceed. And of course, there's the bosses. But other than that, the game is mostly made up of a lot of baddies in Hyrule that you can simply ignore and run by. It would be nice if the next installment introduced some new enemies and found creative ways to put Link in more situations where combat is required. Which brings me to my next point. I won't harp on this aspect for too long because it's possibly the most common criticism of Breath of the Wild, but I have to talk about it at least some. From its very origins, Zelda games have always had darker, gloomier dungeon levels sprinkled throughout the game. Typically, dungeons also introduce new enemies to the experience with each additional dungeon, which is something Breath of the Wild is lacking in diversity of enemies. I enjoy the divine beasts and even the shrines, but there's certain things that dungeons provide that these don't. Once again, combat was more essential in the dungeon levels, and they also gave the game a more darker and serious tone. It made for a terrific balance between the light and hope of the land of Hyrule and the gloomy and sinister depths of the dungeons. I find Breath of the Wild pretty lacking in this area. Again, I like the divine beasts, and I think they were cool new additions, but even they don't carry that fantastically eerie feeling of dread that the iconic dungeons did. Something else that was pretty much non-existent in Breath of the Wild was mini-bosses. They used to be fun and interesting new challenges that prepared you for the upcoming heavyweight matchup. In many cases, the mini-bosses were more memorable than the actual bosses. Some 90s kids like myself may remember the electric slime creature at the end of the water temple, but the mini-boss battle with Dark Link? That is iconic and unforgettable. Mini-bosses could help alleviate several aspects I've already mentioned. They would add some much-needed combat to the sequel while also giving the game a more sinister tone. Speaking of a darker game, this next topic is less of a criticism and more of an exciting suggestion that I've been pondering for years. The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past was released on the Super Nintendo in 1991, and to this day it's still recognized as one of the greatest video games of all time. By Super Nintendo standards, it had a giant world map, filled with detail, iconic themes, and plenty of challenges. It was a map big enough for an entire epic Zelda game, but as you're approaching the halfway point of your adventure, the game takes a dramatic turn, and the world you once knew as Hyrule now becomes the Dark World, a place where the land is cursed and where Ganon reigns. It's essentially the same as regular Hyrule in terms of structure and geography, but it's also corrupted, has new enemies, new dangers, and it's simply a much darker place. It took the world you had already become accustomed to and gave it a fresh experience with a completely different tone. With the use of the magic mirror, Link could travel between the dimensions of the light world and the dark world of Hyrule, and it was extremely necessary to do so for the sake of the game's progression. As a child, it blew my tiny little mind when I played this game for the first time, and I realized this was basically two worlds in one game. A handful of years later, I played The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time for the first time on the Nintendo 64. In a way that's similar to A Link to the Past, you go through the first half of the game when the story then makes a dramatic shift. Link picks up the Master Sword and travels 7 years into the future where Ganon has now taken over Hyrule Castle. The first time I stepped out of the Temple of Time as adult Link, my jaw dropped at the sight of the fallen Hyrule Kingdom. I stepped out into what was once a joyful and cheery market to find hell on earth, where life had been utterly destroyed and the only thing surrounding me was the undead walking. I was shook, but also tremendously excited. In my mind, this was the dark world I experienced in A Link to the Past, but now it's in 3D. Then I stepped out of the castle and into Hyrule Field, and once I saw the sun was up, everything was still green, and the same cheery Hyrule Field theme began to play, I was admittedly incredibly disappointed. I expected the whole world to have fallen under Ganon's reign, not just Hyrule Castle. Ever since that moment as a 9-year-old, I've been hoping to see a modern portrayal of a dark Hyrule world. So now approaches Breath of the Wild 2. What if you took the beautiful and gigantic world of Breath of the Wild, have some dramatic, cataclysmic event take place, and now you have the Dark World. The same geography, but new creepier enemies, a dreadful atmosphere, and a brand new adventure. This wouldn't have to be all that's new to the game. You could expand the map or even find ways to take Link and Zelda's quest outside of Hyrule, but a dark version of a modern Hyrule would be a welcome sight from myself indeed. Something else that could significantly improve is the sense of gratification with the weapons and items you obtain. One of the controversial aspects of this game is the breakable weapons, and if I'm being honest, I thought I would hate this aspect more than I did. Once I got the Master Sword and realized it had just a 10-minute cooldown, a lot of my frustration was alleviated. But with that being said, there are still very few items and weapons that truly leave you feeling satisfied and accomplished after obtaining them. For example, past Zelda games have given you stuff like the boomerang, the hookshot, and the Megaton hammer. And once you had these items, they were yours to keep. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. It was an enjoyable experience to add something to Link's arsenal that opened up the world to him in ways that it hadn't before, but now everything just seems so temporary and naturally insignificant as a result.
Thank you, Link, for avenging my dead daughter and for saving our entire land. Our gratitude cannot be understated. We are forever indebted to you. Now please, accept this reward. It's a below average to mediocre at best staff that you may or may not enjoy for 5 minutes before it inevitably shatters into a million pieces.
You see how disappointing some of these aspects are? Many of the subquests are more of the same. For example, I'm in Kakariko Village, and I'm assigned the task of collecting chickens for this resident and returning all 10 to him. And as I'm doing it, I'm eagerly anticipating what the reward will be. I remember doing this same task in Ocarina of Time, and as a reward in that game, you're given a bottle. Now if you've played any previous Zelda games, then you know that bottles are a really big deal. You can store potions in them for both magic and health, you can also store bugs in them, and even special elements in them as well. Probably the most useful aspect was the ability to store fairies, which is an instant revival and another opportunity after a failed attempt. So after a half hour, I've got all the chickens, I return them to the resident, and what do I get this time? 50 rubies. Are you kidding me? Now mind you, at this point, I had over 36,000 rubies, so I can't possibly understate how insignificant this reward was. I could have simply collected gems and sold them for 3 times the value in less than half the time it took me to collect the chickens. Simply put, the subquests are not crucial enough to keep me interested. Other than the main story sequences and the shrines, nothing else is really necessary or significant. What I would suggest is that maybe in the next game, they can make it to where if I complete enough submissions, then I'm rewarded with something more significant. This needs to be things that incentivize doing all these submissions that are sprinkled throughout the world. Otherwise, they just start to feel like a waste of my time, energy, and resources. It's nice to have an extremely open world for exploration, but the desire to explore that world is limited when the rewards and the sense of fulfillment are limited as well. I had this open world game before me, but more often than not, I was still operating in a very linear mindset, which definitely wasn't what the developers intended. Something that was more enjoyable was some of the more recognizable music and themes throughout my adventure. I can't tell you how giddy I got when I simply recognized Ganon's original dungeon theme at Breath of the Wild's Death Mountain. For the most part, Breath of the Wild's music relies on more peaceful and relaxing themes, which blend well with the nature and the atmosphere of this version of Hyrule. With that being said, I do occasionally long for some more adventurous and epic themes of the more traditional Hyrule fields. It would be nice to see more of those energetic and exhilarating themes incorporated into the game's sequel. Now, there definitely is amazing elements of adventure, but some of that sense of adventure is lost when traveling becomes too easy. Now hear me out, because this is one of my most unique and possibly odd criticisms that I make of this game. Horseback riding is great and parasailing is great. Now please, let's keep it necessary to keep that means of travel. Here's essentially what I mean. The shrines and towers become instant teleportation locations once you initially access them, but they're sprinkled all over the map. So by the time you've traveled around the world for the first time, you can quickly access almost any precise spawn point you need to with the simple press of a button. At a certain point, horses became irrelevant, because why bother riding when I can simply teleport to the exact spot I need to go? I almost prefer it where shrines couldn't be used as travel, but instead only the towers. This would naturally keep all forms of transportation relevant no matter how deep you got into the game. Sure, it may seem more tedious initially, but I think it would naturally increase the sense of adventure and would keep the world from feeling like it's becoming smaller. By the way, fast traveling feels a little less special in this game, and it's kind of just what you do to get from point A to point B. In games past, fast travel involved some activity that was often tied to a special item like an instrument. In A Link to the Past, you play a flute, and your bird buddy sweeps you away and takes you to a location of your choosing. In Ocarina of Time, you use an ocarina, and you have to play a specific song that's associated with that location. But in Breath of the Wild, you access a location initially, and then you just basically travel there. There's no special song, no specific item involved, no unique character to assist you. You just go. And that's as interesting as it gets. This may seem like some extreme nitpicking at this point, but these details and magical elements are what make Zelda Zelda. If you sacrifice too many of these unique details, then you begin to have more of a generic adventure game, and less of the game that made Zelda the legend that it is today. I feel like I've been focusing on the negatives a bit much at this point, so let's get back to some things that I love and that I would like to see more of in the sequel. Link regaining his memories are some of the most beautiful parts of this game, and there's a deep history to Link's past and a lot of things to remember. This is a story element that could certainly continue, and a means to propel the story forward. The game certainly knew how to deliver on its epic moments. The scale and the use of the Divine Beast was an exciting experience. The way of obtaining the Master Sword was unique and well built up, considering how I kept going back to the Lost Woods each time I gained a new heart container to see if I had enough health to finally wield the sword. By the time I was able to do it, the process of getting it was made oh so satisfying, and the epic and iconic moment did a masterful job of paying homage to the games before it. Absolute goosebumps. Now, the end of the game has some awesome sequences as well. Seeing the champions get their revenge on Ganon with the use of the Divine Beast was a pleasure to see. Although I'm gonna be honest, I wasn't a huge fan of Calamity Ganon's first form. It's basically a somewhat annoying trope of a climax at this point. Man, I can't wait to see what Calamity Ganon looks like. Oh, he's a giant spider. Man, I can't wait to see the 3D version of Mother Metroid. She's a giant spider. Man, I can't wait to finally fight Sadler. He's a giant spider. So what's next? Spider Bowser? Although I wasn't thrilled about the battle with Spider Ganon, at least it was that, an actual battle. Ganon's second form, on the other hand, is a much more traditional and familiar character design, which I was thrilled to see. Setting up the final battle in Hyrule Field has become a solid go-to climax of Zelda games. And at the beginning of this final battle, Zelda drops one of the most epic and goosebump-inducing lines in video game history.
Link, you may not yet be at a point where you have fully recovered your power, or all of your memories. But courage need not be remembered, for it is never forgotten.
But unfortunately, the next bit was a bit of a letdown as well. At least if you're like me and want your video games to give you at least the most minuscule resemblance of a challenge. This fight doesn't do that, as Homeboy Ganon literally just sits there the entire time. He seems to hardly notice as you're sending fatal light arrows at all of his weak spots. Again, it's not that these criticisms are meant to point out something that is completely bad, but rather I'm simply pointing out how something I enjoyed could have been perfected with just a little bit more attention to detail. Ultimately, I enjoyed this final sequence. The rain, the atmosphere, the music, the horse, the bow of light, Link's epic last shot, and Zelda delivering the final blow and fulfilling her character arc. Its ending was fantastic, and it wasn't quite perfect, but it easily could have been. And honestly, that pretty much sums up my opinion of this game as a whole. At the end of the day, it's probably not my favorite Zelda game of all time, but it could have been. It seriously had that opportunity if it just executed some of the more crucial and important elements of Zelda games to its fullness. The developers of Breath of the Wild 2 have some big decisions to make. Do they continue to move the Zelda franchise away from its traditional rules, mechanics, and story threads, or do they go back to their roots and embrace what the longtime fans have been crying out for? Or do they try to walk the tightrope and perfectly balance the newer aspects of the franchise with the strong legacy that's got them to where they are today? I have no idea what Nintendo is planning, considering how they're one of the most secretive and close to the chest companies out there. But as far as general entertainment goes, there's no company I'm more comfortable putting my trust in than Nintendo. A trust they've earned from decades straight of delivering quality and wonderfully developed characters and video games. Let me know in the comments section what you love and didn't love about Breath of the Wild and what you would like to see in its sequel. Make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.